Good morning, Kat Fitzpatrick here again, reading a little bit more from my recent publication, For the Love of Vietnam, A War, a Family, a CIA Official, and the Best Evacuation Story Never Heard. I'm reading this primarily for my nieces and nephews in Hawaii, but for anyone who would rather listen perhaps than to sit and read a book, which is something I often do. So I think it's a nice option. I also find that if I actually read the words and then listen, it's a completely different experience. So I just wanted to add this into the lexicon of things that I've put out there in the world, hoping that they will make a difference for the better. In any case, I hope you enjoy. I'll read for about 20 minutes. This first section is called In Honor of Those Who Served, and I will choke up and I will take a deep breath and keep reading. Even though I've written this and I've read it 1,000 times and edited it multiple times, it still somehow touches me deeply. So I just breathe with me and bear with it, and I hope you enjoy. In Honor of Those Who Served. When you enter the Washington, D.C. National Mall from 21st and Constitution Avenues, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is invisible. It sits sunken in the wide green lawn as if harboring a truth too difficult to bear. When I arrived on a muggy August morning in 2014, my heart beat like a drum. I was not a sightseeing tourist, but a sort of pilgrim, a writer seeking benediction, and my chances for that seemed as unclear as the profile of my obscure destination. My decision to write about Vietnam had begun in a time of personal difficulty. The circumstances of my life had been precarious. I had unfairly lost a job due to illness. I was staying temporarily in my son Dylan's college housing. It was a pretty rough spot, and I had little to no savings. And despite the overwhelming conviction that I must write about my family Saigon stories, I did not want to presume to overwrite or circumnavigate the stories of the American soldiers, or of anybody who was involved, in fact. But in this case, I was really thinking of our veterans. I simply could not continue to write about the war without acknowledging them, many of whom had been sent alone and unprepared to serve in the same country where I had spent much of my 8th year. I willed myself forward along the concrete path, my camera gripped in a damp and trembling hand. And this is one of the photos that I took as I walked down. Kind of see the panorama of the wall. It is really something in person. I'd seen pictures before, but being there was definitely much more moving. I descended into the scrape in the lawn, and the mirrored wall of carved names overshadowed me. I came to a quick halt. A dozen yards in front of me was a man pressing his hand. See, this is where I always get it, to the slick black marble, his eyes back, his head back, his eyes searching for a name. His grief was palpable. I didn't want to intrude, so I silently captured the image from a distance. As I was reviewing my photos, he departed, and I had to hurry to catch up. My voice quivered as I asked permission to use the picture and told him a little bit about what I was doing and why. He nodded as I spoke, as if in approval. People can't forget, he said. They have to remember. There are a lot of names on that wall. Over 58,000. And that's why I'm writing about it, I said, to remind people about Vietnam. His wife said his buddy was 3 days from coming home. My eyes stung, and though I felt ashamed to be the one near tears when he was the one who had borne the loss, I extended a hand. The veteran graciously took it, his grip comforting and gentle. "Thank you for what you are doing," he said. "I'll do my best for you, sir. I'll do my best." As our hands parted, I could not help but feel like I had received the blessing that I'd been so earnestly seeking. I do not often write about the battlefields and those who fought. My stories about other times and other places, but the thought of the veterans stays with me. It's kind of a lot. Deep breath. Just shows you, though, how much there is to all this. So my stories are about other times and other places, but the thought of the veterans stay with me, their experiences and their sacrifice always present. I hope my work honors them and bolsters a renewed interest in what that undeclared war represents to our history and to our future. This is a picture of him. His name is John Granfors, I believe. He passed away since 2014. I went to look him up on Facebook, and both he and his wife had this picture as their profile picture. I did try to reach out to her to talk to her before my presentation last year and didn't hear back, which was okay, but I was just gratified that that moment meant as much to them as to me. And I really do feel like meeting him gave me the permission to move forward with this. So this next section is called Man on a Mission, Part 1. This is just a scene of Vietnam, it's from, like a stock photo, but kind of the way it used to be in the 60s. The history of Vietnam is long and very different from our concept that they're family and city-states, and it's just very long, complicated. It's not all in this book. I try to explain a little bit, but I just wanted to put that out there because it gives a little bit of a backdrop. And so this starts with End of a Nation. On April 30th, 1975, Saigon, the capital of the Republic of South Vietnam, was extinguished like an ancient flame. In the weeks leading up to that day, as 18 heavily armored divisions of the North Vietnamese Army closed in on the city, panic filled the streets, the homes and the offices of Americans and South Vietnamese alike. After 10 years of fighting the Northern Communists, the fear of their arrival was palpable. On April 3rd, CIA officer James E. Welch, chief of a clandestine radio operation, kissed his wife and kids goodbye. They boarded a plane to safety while he stayed behind to maintain business as usual. That was his assignment, but he had other plans. Getting out yesterday. James Welch had every intention of following on the heels of his wife and family as soon as possible, but he wasn't about to leave alone. For nearly 3 years, he'd been the operations chief, a father figure of sorts, for a group of South Vietnamese employees at Mother Vietnam, a PSYOP radio station that broadcast anti-communistic propaganda into the North Vietnam. And that statement, a father figure of sorts, actually comes straight out of his one of his letters. He mentions that. Just so you know, a lot of this research came from letters that he wrote and my mom wrote. So just a very profound lesson in writing kind of daily life. So that operation was housed in an old building fondly known as House 7 because it was located at 7 Hong Tap 2 Street. Although it was associated with the CIA headquarters at the American Embassy just down the road, it was classified as super secret and not easily identifiable to the average passerby. Still, the North Vietnamese spy network was at least as active as the CIA's, and the radio station had been infiltrated by more than one Viet Cong passing as ordinary citizen. So James Welch's staff, all of whom he felt a personal obligation to protect, knew what it would mean if the city were taken by the enemy. Their identities were not safe. They would be called out as American sympathizers. There would be little hope for survival, and drastic action would have to be taken. As the star of the show put it, if the communists take over and we can't get out, my father will shoot us and then commit suicide. There's no better motivation than certain death, and Welch took the situation in hand and began tactical planning to get his people out yesterday. Your husband may be shot by the bureaucracy, he wrote to his wife the day she and the family left, but I intend to get my people out regardless of the consequences. There's only one problem. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon had a huge investment in making it look like the Vietnam situation was just fine. And while they let his family out, they weren't planning to let any U.S. government employee go anywhere, not Americans, and definitely not South Vietnamese. It was going to take a clever, if not devious, sleight of hand to get his people out. Luckily, Welch was trained in exactly that. In propaganda, or It's called Psychological Warfare, and really what it means, and this is according to PsyWarrior.com, which is a site that I've used and am actually like Facebook friends and research buddies with Herb Friedman, who is in charge of a great deal of the research there. Their slogan is "Capture their minds and their hearts and souls will follow." And Mother Vietnam in particular was one that was a very kind of a sweet message, wanting to bring Viet Cong or North Vietnamese over to the South with the idea that it's much better here and come back to Mother Vietnam. Another little quote here is, "Propaganda planning is a continuous process requiring imagination and determination." Kind of goes back to my dad for the Year of the Rat. And this is a picture. This you're not going to be able to see very well, but up here is the very super secret radio station. All right, so that was getting out yesterday. And then we have some pictures of the actual operation. I believe these weren't marked, but I do know that there was a author, I'll try to remember his name, that took a lot of pictures. So it's fortunate we have some. These actually were taken before my dad got there. Mother Vietnam was one of 5 propaganda radio programs that were broadcast out of House 7, beginning shortly after the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973. Soon after wrapping up the Paris talks, the distinct programs, each operating on a separate frequency, were nurtured into being. These stations were intended to put pressure on the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to abide by the terms of the ceasefire and hew toward pro-democracy attitudes. So generally that meant to just, again, putting out information out into the world, not necessarily saying where it came from, but encouraging the other side to do the right thing as far as the South Vietnamese and my father could see. There's a list of definitions of white, gray, and black radio, which is very technical. I'll just pass over that because it's not that much fun to listen to, but you can always refer to it there. And then a definition of the CIA, which you probably know is the Central Intelligence Agency, but it was created in 1947 as a new peacetime intelligence service. Intelligence in this case means information. It replaced the OSS, which had been established after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1942. And employees often returned to the CIA as the company. And they were sent all over the world to gather intelligence or information. So you might think of the CIA as like omnipresent, but they're really not supposed to work in the United States. It's all foreign service. If somebody tells you they're in the foreign service, often it will mean the CIA. And the FBI is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So they're kind of like sister organizations. FBI is in the United States and CIA is outside the United States. According to CIA.gov, CIA employees are the nation's eyes, ears, and sometimes its hidden hand. Their mission is to preempt further threats and further U.S. national security objectives by collecting foreign intelligence that matters, producing objective all-source analysis, conducting effective covert action as directed by the president, covert meaning hidden, that's where the spy thing comes in, and safeguarding the secrets to help keep our nation safe. And so there's a little piece, again, you wouldn't be able to see it here, but my dad's CIA employment application, which includes, it's titled Intelligence Research Specials, GS7. And GS is the level of government worker. I think he worked his way up to GS13, but I'm not sure. I think I have it in here. We'll come across it later. All right. I've been reading for about 14 minutes, so I'm going to go through the next chapter and then stop after that. This is called Trained for Psychological Warfare. And that little picture of my dad, I actually had not seen before recently. It's a passport photo. That's one interesting thing about doing all this research. I have I don't think I have a ton of material, but as I go through it, sometimes I find more and more little pieces here and there that somehow I had missed before. So it's kind of like a treasure hunt. It's actually quite fun. All right, trained for psychological warfare. James Welch had become a spy for the CIA in early 1952 when he was recruited by the company shortly after graduating with his master's in history and international affairs from Catholic University in Washington, D.C. He was likely sought after because he had been singled out as having a proclivity for German during his college naval military training during World War II. The only son of Georgia and Edna Welch of Middletown, New York, which is just south of where I live now, he entered military service in 1943 through the V-12 program, which was a precursor of like the ROTC, if you're familiar with that. It was a successful effort to both train officers and fill the colleges and universities that were suffering from a lack of enrollment due to the high number of enlistments. But becoming an officer was not in the cards for him. According to his younger sister, Jean, what happened was that they perceived he had a real affinity for language, so they put him in an accelerated German program. He knew something was wrong, so he went to his commanding officer and said, "I'm not in the navigation class, what's going on?" They told him it's okay, not to worry. However, when he sat for his final exam, the one that would promote him to a naval ensign, equivalent to a second lieutenant in the Army, he found himself at a great disadvantage. "It was awful," said Jean. "He had to take the test on things he'd never learned. He was so smart. He figured out most of it, but he missed passing by 1/10 of a percentage point. My parents, or their parents, went up to see him commissioned, and he wasn't. It was a horrible and sad day. He took his uniform in his arms, rode the public bus, and went to turn it in." I always find that to be such a poignant and sad moment, where you anticipate graduating or crossing the finish line only to find out you hadn't. And interestingly enough, it was because of his advisors, not his own fault. Fortunately, said Jean, her brother was optimistic, and his optimistic and philosophical nature won out over despair. So then he was a regular Navy man, she said, and he was assigned to New Orleans, where he worked as a carpenter. It was a happy time in his life. The pressure was off. He'd bombed, and he could handle it. Had he passed his officer's test, he would have likely remained in the Navy and never filled out the typewritten application to be a foreign affairs officer at the CIA. As it was, he was hired by the intelligence agency and sent to Munich in 1956, where he worked undercover in East Berlin. According to a CIA colleague, Leo Small, who I called one day, in 2013, I think, and had a couple conversations. It was very just kind of interesting to be interviewing a former CIA guy. But of course, he knew my dad and was really fond of him. So, but he said they were there to clandestinely assist with German intelligence gathering. There's some German in here, so I'm going to shred it. I'll muddle through. "We are in the same unit," Leo Small said. "We were both in liaison with the German service, okay?" The official name of that office was Bundesnachrichtenbundes. Federal was Nachrichten, and so when he said it meant sort of an intelligence, somebody I know that knows German said it kind of also means news, and Dienst, which is service. So, and naturally, since my dad knew German, I'm sure he could have said that really easily. Forgive me for for fumbling that. And Leo Small went on, "We had regular offices, ostensibly," he stressed the word ostensibly, "working in the civilian field." Welch was reassigned back to Washington in September 1962, where he became more and more well-versed in psychological warfare, more colloquially known as propaganda. This expertise garnered him another long-term overseas assignment, this time in Korea beginning in 1970, in operations overseen by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. He was to head up the intelligence agency's broadcast into communist China. Welch's pro-American programs were meant to sway the citizens of the Middle Kingdom toward a greater affinity to their Cold War enemy in the West. According to English author and teacher John D. Clare, China's relations with the U.S. were rock bottom before the 1970s. For the Chinese Communists, America embodied capitalism and imperialism. After 1970, however, as China's relations with the USSR continued to be strained, relations with the United States, To the surprise of the world, improved, he wrote. This may have come as a surprise to the world, perhaps, but most likely not to Welch, who very well may have had a hand in the pro-American propaganda being sent out of Seoul toward Peking, as the Chinese capital used to be known. It was changed to Beijing in the late 70s. His success was so great that reports and recommendations were sent high priority by packet to Washington, gaining accommodation from Kissinger himself. Ironically, he worked himself right out of a job. Within 2 years of his efforts, relations with the old enemy had thawed so much that President Richard Nixon flew there, becoming the first U.S. president to visit the People's Republic of China since its establishment in 1949. As the Shanghai Communique on February 28, 1972, at the Shanghai Communique on February 28, 1972, the Chinese and U.S. governments agreed to work toward the normalization of relations, and so Welch's broadcasts from Korea ceased. Thus, Vietnam. It actually came as no surprise that he was reassigned to Saigon. It was a duty no overseas CIA officer could avoid in those days. At the time, Vietnam had the largest CIA presence in the world and was still a military hotspot, despite the ongoing peace talks between the North and the South. Though it was an inevitable assignment, Welch took it up with some zeal, feeling that his talents were sorely needed. So I have nothing corroborating that he had, his work directly helped Nixon go to China, but it just seems a very, since it was exact same timing, it seems like there must have been some correlation. But that's the thing about history and documentation. A lot we don't know, and that's why researching is kind of fun. When I come back next time, I'm going to read Stalin's Ghost and the Love of Vietnam. That's where the title of the book came from. So thanks for joining me. I hope you guys in Hawaii are doing okay, and I will look forward to reading more later. Take good care.